The first page of the recovered file opens with a sound that isn't there anymore. Metal ringing against metal. The slow echo of a hammer inside a cold hangar. Aberdeen Proving Ground, Maryland, February 1942. Fog creeps low across the proving field, where skeletal shapes of tanks wait under floodlights. The air smells of cordite and wet steel. Somewhere beyond the test sheds, an officer coughs, a typewriter clicks, and another series of shells are fired into sheets of armor leaning against wooden braces. Each impact shakes the concrete floor. The fragments fall like hail, clattering at the boots of the men who record them. Among those men stands Captain Walter Hensley, his pencil tapping against a small notepad stained with graphite dust and oil. He doesn't talk much. He observes, calculates, and redraws. When others see noise, he sees geometry, the way a shell's trajectory bends when it meets resistance, the way heat scars a plate at 30 degrees versus 45. In the Army's hierarchy, he's just another ordnance officer, an engineer reassigned from a Detroit factory to help refine the M4 Sherman's armor. But the longer he works, the more he sees something no one wants to admit. The Sherman, in its current form, is not ready for the war that's coming. The tests from Tunisia already prove it. German 50mm rounds slice through the armor like a knife through wet paper. The reports arrive stamped urgent, but the tone is bureaucratic. Change takes time. Cost matters more than the shape of survival. Hensley studies a captured Panzer III plate brought in by the British liaison team. The sloped differently, angled, not flat. He traces it with his hand, noting the ricochet marks. Most of the hits slid off rather than penetrating. He runs a ruler along the edge, checks the slope, and writes down the number, 47 degrees. A small deviation, but decisive. In his head, the logic is simple. The steeper the angle, the greater the chance of deflection. The challenge is convincing people who don't think in lines and numbers. He sketches a revised Sherman hull on tracing paper, adjusting the glassy plate, rearranging internal mounts. The new angle would require only modest tooling changes but a redefinition of armor philosophy. It's not strength through thickness. It's survival through deflection. He brings the design to his supervisor, Colonel Whiteman, who listens without looking up from a folder. Captain, the M4 is the Army's workhorse. We can't stop production for every bright idea that comes through the door. Hensley waits for the colonel to finish his paperwork. Sir, he says, voice even. The Panzer's slope increases effective thickness by nearly 30% without adding weight. We could adapt it easily. The colonel sighs. You want us to copy German designs? Tell that to the congressman funding this thing. File your proposal. We'll review it after quarter's end. The conversation ends there. The official paperwork routes through channels faster than he expects, but not in the direction he hopes. The file returns with a red stamp, rejected, non practical. Attached is a typed note. Increased manufacturing cost outweighs theoretical advantage. Proceed with standard configuration. He places the document in a brown envelope marked H47, initials and date at the corner. It should end there. But a few days later, he notices the envelope missing from the filing cabinet. The clerk swears she never saw it. The records officer checks the ledger, no file by that name. The notation has been erased, not crossed out. Erased. Weeks turn into months. The war in Europe intensifies. Reports from the North African campaign fill bulletin boards. Burned out Shermans, hulls pierced, crews lost. The engineers analyze, redesign, and reissue minor adjustments, nothing radical. Hensley watches as colleagues celebrate the tank's reliability under adverse conditions. But he can't forget the test fields. The angle, the deflection, the numbers that make death avoidable. He keeps a copy of his sketch folded in his notebook, hidden between pages of ballistic tables. Sometimes at night, when the barracks go quiet, he unfolds it and traces the lines again, running his finger along the slope that might save men he'll never meet. In December 1943, snow covers the proving ground. A new shipment of German armor arrives for analysis, captured near Kasserine. One plate bears a perfect ricochet scar. Hensley measures the indentation, then the angle of entry. Again 47 degrees. The same number. The test officer beside him laughs. What's so funny about angles, Captain? Hensley doesn't answer. He writes a single line in his field journal. War is fought in degrees, not inches. Later that night, he mails a personal letter addressed to his own army post office number in France, though he hasn't been assigned there yet. Inside is a carbon copy of his blueprint and one note. If the system refuses change, build it yourself. By spring, he's transferred overseas, reassigned to a maintenance unit near the French coast, part of the logistical buildup for what no one yet calls D-Day. Before he departs, he walks once more through the testing hangar. The old Sherman hulls sit lined up for scrap, their surfaces rusting in the damp. He touches the steel one last time, leaves his glove print, and walks away. His draft files are boxed for storage. In one corner of a filing room, an officer scribbles a final notation, H-47, non-essential materials destroyed. Years later, a single photograph surfaces in a Normandy archive. A Sherman wreck burned almost beyond recognition. But the frontal armor catches the light differently. It's not the same angle. A French historian circles the anomaly and sends it to Washington for verification. The Ordnance Department replies, no such model produced. Likely field distortion. The photo is filed away again. But in the corner, faintly visible through soot, is a hand-engraved marking, H-47. Back in 1942, the memory of that number begins to fade from official records, but not from those who worked beside him. A technician once overheard Hensley explaining to a fellow engineer that steel could be taught to behave differently. It's not what you make it from, he said quietly. It's how you make it stand. The phrase lingers like an echo from an unmarked grave. He didn't mean philosophy. He meant slope, deflection, geometry, the language of survival. By early 1944, the Army is mass-producing Shermans at a rate of 75 per day. Factories hum. War demands efficiency. There's no room for artistic engineering. But buried somewhere in the blueprints of a forgotten workshop, a variant sits on a shelf. Its drawing signed by a man no longer in Maryland. The title block reads simply, Alternative Hull Geometry Proposal, Field Adaptable. No date, no routing number, no approval signature. Outside, snow gives way to rain. Workers on the test range load another series of 88mm shells to demonstrate German penetration capability. Each shot tears through the standard Sherman plate. The visiting brass nod grimly. One colonel remarks that the men just have to get closer, hit first. Hensley, standing a few steps behind, keeps his expression neutral. He watches the ricocheting fragments scatter across the mud. When the range officer calls for the next test, he quietly slips away, notebook under his arm. That night he writes a new entry, neat, almost emotionless. If theory fails to persuade command, demonstration will. He tears out the page, folds it twice, and slides it behind the blueprint copy in his satchel. Somewhere in that action, a decision takes root. Not the dramatic sort that wins medals, but the quiet, methodical kind that history never records. He knows he can't change Washington. But maybe, somewhere closer to the front, he can change the steel itself. Months later, a radio operator transcribing field transmissions in France will hear a curious call sign break through static. Angle 1 requesting status check. Coordinates St. Lo. The operator frowns. The call sign isn't in any registry. He writes it down anyway, then crosses it out. The entry survives only as a faint pencil mark in a forgotten logbook. Years afterward, when that same operator reads about a ghost Sherman, surviving multiple direct hits near those coordinates, he will remember the sound of that transmission, metallic, distant, untraceable. He'll think about the voice that spoke it, calm and precise, repeating coordinates as if calculating something invisible. The official histories will omit the name, the blueprint, the number. But in that first file, before it vanished, one line remains legible beneath the rejected stamp. Proposed angle, 47 degrees. It's not much, just a number. Yet, in the long silence of war, sometimes a number can become a ghost. Sometimes the echo of an idea survives longer than the man who drew it. Rain drummed softly on the tin roof of the maintenance depot, turning the dirt outside into a slow-moving river of mud and oil. The war, for most soldiers, meant motion. Marches, convoys, assaults. But for Captain Walter Hensley it had become a quiet prison of repetition. Weld, patch, paint, sign off, repeat. Rows of Sherman tanks sat lined like corpses under canvas, their flanks scarred and blackened, the smell of burnt fuel and cordite trapped inside their hollow shells. He walked among them each morning, clipboard in hand, like a surgeon inspecting the aftermath of failed operations. No ceremony, no inspection from superiors, just the monotonous silence of repair work in the shadow of a war that was moving faster than paperwork could follow. It was late spring of 1944 near St. Lo, Normandy. The front was pushing east, the beaches secured, the hedgerows turning each mile into a contest of patience. To most officers, the depot was a dead-end assignment. To Hensley, it was a laboratory with an infinite supply of broken specimens. He didn't complain. He worked at night when the noise of engines masked his torch. His men respected him because he never raised his voice. They said the captain could fix a tank with a look, that he could sense weakness in steel the way doctors sensed fever in skin. The mechanics whispered that he was half mathematician, half ghost. But nobody questioned the results. The Shermans he touched lasted longer in combat. That was enough. He slept in an office that smelled of graphite and cigarette smoke. On the desk, buried under parts manifests, lay a single folded drawing, the blueprint he had smuggled from Maryland, the one marked rejected. It was creased and stained, but the lines were still precise. A redesigned glassy plate at 47 degrees, mathematically optimized for deflection. Above the line, in faded pencil, the title Alternative Hull Geometry, Field Adaptable. Every night he unfolded it and stared until the lines blurred, then folded it again and slipped it back under the pile. He had no orders to build it, no permission, but the idea refused to die. The days stretched gray and wet. Supply trucks came and went, delivering damaged hulls from the front, each one a study in failure. Burn marks, penetration points, jagged holes in the exact same places. He traced them with his gloved hand, memorizing angles of entry. The same pattern always. Head-on hits that the Sherman couldn't shrug off. Every angle too steep, every surface too flat. The tank's power wasn't its armor, he thought. It was its reliability, its numbers. But numbers meant nothing when crews burned inside. One afternoon, while inspecting wrecks from an ambushed column, he found something that shifted everything. Among the twisted remains of a Panzer III lay an almost intact side plate. He pried it loose with help from a mechanic and set it under the depot's work light. The steel was dense, crystalline, sloped at a graceful angle that caught the light like glass. It wasn't invincible, but it thought differently. German engineers had designed their tanks to deflect, not absorb. He ran his fingers over the smooth surface, murmuring the number that had haunted him since Aberdeen. 47 degrees. That night, Hensley began sketching. A piece of cigarette paper became his canvas, then a crate lid, then a proper sheet from the depot's drafting supplies. He calculated the stress load, the pivot weight, the center of mass. Every variable balanced perfectly, like music. When dawn came, he had a working design that could be welded from existing Sherman parts and a section of scavenged German armor. He burned the rough drafts, leaving only the final drawing and a note to himself. Test on Hullis 19. Record impact results privately. At breakfast, his sergeant found him staring at the rain. Captain, command's asking if we can send 3 more tanks by Friday. Hensley nodded without looking up. We'll make it 4, he said. The sergeant frowned but didn't ask. Everyone knew the captain's tanks came out heavier, cleaner, and somehow stronger. Nobody complained. When the men left that night, he stayed behind. The depot was silent except for the occasional groan of settling steel. He worked under a single hanging bulb, the light flickering each time lightning flashed outside. Sparks burst around him as he cut the damaged hull of Sherman S-19 and re-welded it with his modified plates. The smell of hot metal mixed with rain leaking through the roof. Each weld felt like defiance, small, deliberate acts against an invisible authority. He didn't think of glory or discovery. He thought of survival, of the crews who might live 1 minute longer. He tested the first prototype using dummy rounds from the depot range. The first impact left only a dent. The second deflected clean off. The third cracked the corner seam but not the core. He exhaled quietly. It worked, not perfectly but enough to change odds. He documented nothing, wrote no report. He painted over the welds so no one would notice. The modification was invisible unless you measured. And no one measured. Days passed. Tanks rolled out, some bearing his hidden work. Word spread among drivers that Hensley's refits held up better under fire. Crews joked about his lucky welds. He neither confirmed nor denied it. When supply officers asked why his unit's scrap rate was lower, he blamed good men, good machines. The paperwork supported him. Every rebuilt tank looked standard on paper. Then came the letter. An official envelope, marked from Ordnance Command, sealed in red. Inside, a request for explanation regarding unauthorized material requisitions and non-standard welding practices. Someone had noticed the missing armor sections. The letter was signed by a major who had never seen combat. Hensley read it twice, folded it carefully, and placed it in the furnace. The paper curled, blackened, and vanished. That night, he stayed awake long after the fire died, staring at the blueprints pinned to the wall. His hand trembled slightly when he reached for the lamp switch. He whispered to himself, "They'll never approve it, but it'll keep them alive." The following morning, he ordered his men to load 3 modified Shermans for frontline delivery. Officially, they were standard models. Unofficially, they were something else entirely, angle ones as he called them privately. A nod to geometry, not ego. He signed the transfer papers himself and watched the convoy disappear down the dirt road toward the horizon. Rain fell again, washing the tire tracks into mud. He didn't tell anyone what he'd done. He didn't need to. Within weeks, rumors began trickling back through the supply chain. Stories from tank crews who'd survived direct hits from 88mm shells. Impossible deflections that left German gunners stunned. Some called it luck. Others said there was a ghost batch of Shermans that the enemy couldn't kill. Command dismissed it as morale talk. Hensley said nothing. He kept repairing tanks, signing forms, and waiting for the inevitable inspection. At night, when the generator noise faded and the depot slept, he sat by the doorway listening to the rain. In that silence, doubt gnawed at him. What if the armor failed at the wrong moment? What if his calculations were flawed and men died because of them? He had rewritten official design doctrine without permission, reshaped steel based on a theory. He wasn't sure if he'd built protection or hubris. The war around him continued like a distant storm. Shells, engines, orders, reports. But within that noise, his own world had become smaller and quieter, confined to the hum of welding torches and the rhythm of numbers. Every sound meant something. The crack of steel was tension released. The hiss of cooling metal was the sound of possibility. He no longer saw tanks as machines but as arguments made in iron. Arguments against death, against procedure, against silence. A week later, a message came through the field radio. The German counteroffensive near Saint-Lô had destroyed several armored columns, but one unit had reported surviving under heavy 88 fire. The details were vague. The coordinates matched the route of his modified tanks. The voice on the transmission described an unusual Sherman that seemed to shrug off shells, returning fire until its gun overheated. Then the signal cut off. Hensley turned off the radio and sat for a long time without moving. The rain outside had stopped. The depot was silent except for a slow, rhythmic drip from the roof. He realized then that he had crossed a line, one he could never uncross. The army didn't need men who questioned its math. It needed results, and if those results came from the wrong place, they would be erased. He picked up his pencil and wrote in his notebook, "No one will understand this work until after the war. Maybe not even then." Then he closed the book, extinguished the light, and walked to the doorway. Outside, dawn was rising, pale and uncertain. The world smelled of mud and steel. He took a breath and said quietly, "When you can't change the war, you change the metal." Then he stepped into the light. The sky over Normandy was the color of cold smoke, a low ceiling of mist that turned the morning sun into a dull coin. The ground trembled with the rumble of armor, an invisible earthquake that spread through the hedgerows. Captain Walter Hensley stood beside the lead tank of the column, clipboard in hand, pretending to check maintenance logs. In truth, he was counting seconds, the distance between thunder and echo, measuring artillery in his head the way other men measured distance with a compass. Around him, crews moved with quiet focus, loading ammunition, adjusting tracks, wiping the grime from periscopes. He nodded once to the sergeant in the turret of the modified Sherman, one of the 3 angle ones. The man saluted, unaware that the plates surrounding him were not like the others. The order came down at 0600. Move through the St. Lo Valley. Link up with infantry units on the far ridge. Clear German armor from the road. A routine operation on paper, but Hensley knew better. Intelligence had underestimated enemy numbers before. The terrain, hedgerows, and narrow lanes turned tanks into targets. He climbed onto the side of his modified Sherman, radio headset crackling, and gave the signal to move. The engines roared in staggered harmony, the air filling with the smell of diesel and wet earth. Birds scattered from the trees. Somewhere ahead, a German observer was already adjusting coordinates. By 0730, they reached the first crossroads. The lead Sherman rolled forward cautiously, its gun sweeping left and right. Hensley followed in a jeep behind, eyes fixed on the tank's silhouette. It looked no different from any other Sherman. The same rounded turret, the same clumsy proportions. But he knew the truth beneath the paint. Altered geometry, reweighted armor, invisible defiance. A design no one had approved, tested under no regulation. It was his ghost, made of steel and silence. The first shell came without warning, a sharp whistle, then impact. The ground erupted 10 meters ahead, showering dirt over the column. "Incoming! 88!" someone shouted. Hensley ducked instinctively as the second shell slammed into the side of the road, scattering fragments across the convoy. He could feel the vibrations through the soles of his boots. The men scrambled for cover, returning fire blindly into the fog. Radios spat static and overlapping commands. The Germans had the range, and the narrow hedgerows left no room to maneuver. Then, through the chaos, he saw it, the flash of muzzle fire from the far ridge. A Panther, half concealed behind trees, its barrel glinting. Hensley grabbed the radio. Angle 1, 3 degrees left. Range 600. The gunner adjusted. The Sherman's cannon barked once, the recoil shaking the earth. The shell struck short, exploding against a hedge. Another German shell answered, striking the Sherman squarely on the front glacis. For an instant, Hensley's heart stopped. But instead of piercing, the round glanced off, hissing upward in a spray of sparks. It vanished into the trees. Inside the Sherman, the crew froze in disbelief. The driver cursed. The loader stared at the armor plate where death should have entered. "It bounced," he whispered. "God, it bounced." The commander barked, "Fire again." The second shot hit the Panther low on the turret ring. Smoke burst out from the enemy tank. A cheer rippled through the radio, short-lived but fierce. Hensley's calculations had worked, not on paper but in battle. Angles, range, deflection. The math had come alive. The Germans adjusted. A second Panther appeared, firing from the flank. The shell screamed across the valley, striking the side of another Sherman and tearing it open like a tin can. The explosion rolled through the air, painting the mist orange. Hensley's voice remained calm. "Rotate 20 degrees, hold position. Face them head-on." The modified Sherman obeyed, pivoting slightly so its sloped armor caught the next shell at the perfect deflection angle. Another bounce, another near miracle. The crew inside felt the tremor but not the breach. They returned fire with mechanical precision, methodical as their captain's mind. Minutes stretched like hours. The battle became geometry, Angles, distances, lines of sight drawn and erased by smoke. Each movement calculated, each order spoken with surgical control. Hensley's notes came back to him with every impact. 47 degrees, not 56. The difference between a scar and a crater. Between life and nothing. One of the tankers later said it was as if the German shells slid off like rain. The nickname spread before the fight was even over, the Iron Ghost. But victory was never clean. The second modified Sherman took a direct hit from above when a Panzerfaust team ambushed from the ridge. The explosion peeled back the turret like paper. The crew never made it out. Hensley saw the fireball and didn't move for several seconds. His jaw clenched, but his expression didn't change. He only raised the radio again and said, "Maintain line. Target their flank." The last remaining Angle 1 advanced through the smoke, using the wrecks as cover. Its gun thundered again and again until the hillside fell silent. When it was over, the valley was littered with wreckage. Panthers, Shermans, smoke rising like ghosts from the fields. The rain began again, thin and steady. Men moved among the bodies, calling names, checking for survivors. Hensley walked toward the surviving modified tank. The armor was scorched and dented, but intact. The driver climbed out, shaking, his uniform black with soot. "Sir," he said, voice trembling. "We took 3 direct hits. They just didn't go through." Hensley placed a hand on the hull. The surface was warm, vibrating faintly with residual heat. He didn't answer. In the distant fog, artillery began again. Unrelated, but the sound made everyone flinch. Command arrived 2 hours later. They logged the engagement as a successful defensive action with moderate losses. No mention of experimental armor. No acknowledgement of the anomaly. When an officer asked about the modified tank, Hensley replied, "Standard field repairs, sir." The officer nodded and moved on, uninterested. In war, victory often outranked curiosity. That night, Hensley returned to the depot. The rain had stopped, replaced by a damp silence. The surviving tank had been left outside, its hull reflecting moonlight in strange patterns. He sat beside it, sketching the impact marks in his notebook. Each dent told a story: entry angle, velocity, deviation. The numbers aligned perfectly with his predictions. He should have felt triumph. Instead, he felt hollow. 3 men dead in the second prototype. 3 saved in this one. The balance sheet of war had no column for morality. He closed the notebook and stared at the forest beyond the depot. In the distance, faint gunfire echoed. He thought of the letter he had burned weeks earlier, of the orders he had ignored, of the system he had quietly betrayed. Was this justice or arrogance? He couldn't decide. All he knew was that his design worked, and no one would ever believe it. Before dawn, he ordered the surviving modified Sherman repainted, serial numbers removed, documentation erased. "Field casualty replacement," he told the clerk. "No need to log specifics." The mechanic hesitated but obeyed. By the time the next supply officer inspected the yard, the tank was indistinguishable from any other. Its secret vanished under a coat of olive drab paint. The following evening, a supply convoy heading east reported being escorted through artillery fire by an unregistered Sherman. No markings, no call sign, no crew visible. It appeared out of the mist, flanked the column until dawn, then disappeared toward the woods. German observers later filed conflicting reports. Some claimed to have seen an American tank advance into enemy lines without firing. Others insisted it was destroyed hours earlier. The coordinates didn't match. The serial number didn't exist. The legend of the Ghost Sherman was born that night, whispered among drivers and infantrymen who swore they'd seen it glide silently through the smoke. When headquarters tried to verify, the paperwork led nowhere. No production record. No prototype authorization. The name Hensley appeared only once, in a maintenance log noting his reassignment, pending review. After that, his trail went cold. Some said he transferred to another unit and was lost during an air raid. Others believed he stayed behind to oversee recovery operations and simply vanished. The truth, like the blueprint, sank into silence. In the weeks that followed, the war rolled east, leaving St. Lo a ruin of steel and mud. Mechanics found fragments of a tank hull buried near the ridge, a peculiar section of armor with an angle unlike any standard Sherman. They photographed it, sent it to Ordnance Command, and received a single-line response, likely deformation due to heat stress. The fragment disappeared into scrap inventory soon after. By the time autumn arrived, no one spoke of Captain Hensley. The depot moved, the records closed. But sometimes, when rain fell on the metal roofs and thunder echoed across the fields, the men who had served under him would pause and listen to the rhythm of the storm. They said it sounded like welding torches in the dark, like sparks landing on wet earth. They said it reminded them of the captain's voice, measured, calm, calculating even under fire. The kind of voice that understood that geometry, not glory, kept men alive. Long after the front advanced and the fires of war dimmed, a final rumor lingered among tank crews, that somewhere near St. Lo, when the fog was thick and the artillery quiet, a lone Sherman still moved across the fields, its armor shining at impossible angles, deflecting shells that no longer fell. Whether it was memory or myth, no one could say. But every man who'd seen what Hensley built knew one thing, that some designs aren't written in blueprints. They're written in silence, tested in fire, and buried in mud where history stops looking. The archives opened under fluorescent light, rows of gray boxes labeled with faded ink and government seals. The air was still, stale, the kind that carried the quiet weight of years. It was 1978, and Dr. Samuel Kerr, a historian for the U.S. Army Ordnance Review, was cataloging files for declassification. He'd been at it for months, scanning project codes, logging obsolete weapon reports, discarding duplicates. Nothing extraordinary ever appeared. Until that morning, when he found a folder that wasn't supposed to exist. The tag read H47, but the registry number had been crossed out in red pencil. There was no digital record, no index entry, nothing. Just a thin envelope stamped, destroyed 1943. He turned it over. Someone had written in small, careful handwriting, "Property of Captain W. Hensley." Inside lay a single blueprint, creased, yellowed, edges burned. The drawing was unmistakable. A Sherman tank hull, angled differently from any he'd seen. 47 degrees. He measured it twice. At the bottom of the page, beneath a line of grease stains, was a signature. W. Hensley, Captain, Ordnance Corps, 1943. Kerr leaned back in his chair. The name was unfamiliar. He checked the personnel database. No active records. A few partial citations. One maintenance officer listed missing in action. France, July 1944. No details. The file was otherwise blank, as if someone had scrubbed the man from the system. He closed the folder and stared at the fluorescent light above, listening to its faint buzz. Engineers came and went in wartime, he thought, but this one had drawn something that shouldn't exist. Kerr pulled a second folder from a nearby shelf, Normandy After Action Reports, July 1944, and began cross-referencing. In one report from St. Lo, a tank unit described an unidentified M4 surviving 3 direct hits from an 88mm gun. No serial number, no crew roster. The section commander noted the incident as mechanical anomaly. Another document, an enemy intelligence summary, mentioned a new variant of Sherman with sloped armor observed briefly, presumed misidentified. That line froze him. Misidentified. No such variant existed in the official production list. Kerr traced the references forward year by year through the late war design memos. By 1945, an internal proposal appeared recommending adjusted armor slope on future models to improve ricochet probability. The angle listed 47 degrees. The memo was unsigned. By the 1950s, the Pershing and later Patton series had adopted similar configurations. But none cited the original source. History had moved on without asking where the idea came from. He photocopied the blueprint and locked the original back into its folder. That night, in his apartment, he pinned the copy to the wall beside maps of Normandy and photos of tank wrecks. Under each impact scar, he wrote small notations: trajectory, velocity, deflection angle. He tried to reconstruct what might have happened that day near St. Lo. He imagined the ambush, the German shells, the impossible survival. The report's tone was bureaucratic, unemotional. But between the lines he could feel it. The confusion, the disbelief of men who'd seen something they couldn't explain. The next morning, he visited the Ordnance Museum archives. The curator, an old veteran with a voice like gravel, led him into the storage wing. "You looking for ghosts or blueprints?" the man asked. Kerr smiled thinly. "Both, maybe." They passed rows of rusted tank hulls. At the far end, beneath a tarp, sat a corroded Sherman shell recovered from France in the early 1950s. The curator tapped it with his cane. "That one came from St. Lo," he said. "Supposed to be a standard model, but the armor's off somehow. Different angle. No serial number either. We call it the Orphan." Kerr climbed the platform and brushed the dust away. The frontal plate caught the light strangely, sloped sharper than regulation. He pulled out a tape measure. 47 degrees. The number sent a chill through him. He found himself tracing faint engravings under the turret ring. Scratches barely visible. 2 letters. WH. He whispered the name to himself, as if confirming a rumor. Walter Hensley. The curator shrugged. "Never heard of him. Probably one of those field welders." Kerr said nothing. He photographed the markings and returned to his office, where the blueprint waited. The lines matched perfectly. Over the next weeks, he dug deeper. Interviews with surviving veterans painted a consistent but eerie picture. A mechanic recalled, "An engineer who fixed tanks better than new." A driver spoke of a silent captain who drew on steel with chalk, always talking about angles. One man remembered him burning papers in a drum after receiving orders to stop modifying vehicles. "He said the army didn't understand," the veteran told Kerr. Then one day he was gone. His tent empty, like he'd packed in the middle of the night. The historian assembled his notes into a report labeled Field Modification Case Study, Normandy, 1944. He expected it to vanish into bureaucracy like everything else. But as he wrote, the story began to feel less like an academic footnote and more like a confession belonging to someone else. Hensley's voice lingered in every technical diagram, every welded line. The man had fought a war through design, one calculation at a time, and history had erased him. By late autumn, Kerr requested clearance to publish his findings in the Journal of Military Engineering. The request was denied. "Insufficient verification of data," the review board said. One colonel added privately, "The Army doesn't like ghost stories." The file was reclassified for internal reference only. But Kerr kept a copy. In 1981, he left the Ordnance Department and began writing a book on forgotten innovators of the war. The first chapter bore a familiar title, The Blueprint That Never Existed. While researching, he received a letter from France, a farmer near St. Lo who had read a newspaper excerpt mentioning his work. The man claimed that during recent flooding, parts of an old Sherman had been unearthed near his field. He enclosed a photograph. Kerr examined it carefully. A rusted plate, welded at an angle steeper than any standard hull. In the corner, faint but legible, was an inscription scratched into the metal. "For those who have to stand." Beneath it, initials WH. He stared at the image for a long time, then closed his eyes. The ghost had surfaced again, quietly, like truth breaking through mud. Years passed. The world built newer tanks, faster machines, computers to do the math Hensley once did by hand. But the 47-degree principle remained. Every modern armor schematic used it. Engineers called it optimized deflection geometry, never knowing whose pencil first drew the line. In training lectures, Kerr sometimes mentioned it as a wartime innovation of uncertain origin. Only once, during a private symposium, did he tell the full story. The room fell silent. One young officer asked what happened to the man. Kerr answered softly, "He didn't disappear. History just couldn't explain him." The historian died in 1993. Among his papers, archivists later found the original H-47 blueprint, carefully preserved, with a note attached in neat handwriting. "Return this to history when it's ready to listen." It took another 20 years before the Army publicly acknowledged Hensley's contribution in a declassified engineering review. The report stated simply, "Field modifications conducted by unidentified ordnance officer during the Normandy campaign directly influenced post-war armor development." No medal, no ceremony, just a line in a footnote. Today, the prototype hull from St. Lo rests in a corner of the Ordnance Museum, restored but unmarked. Visitors walk past without knowing what they see. The plaque lists only M4 variant, recovered 1951, origin unknown. Yet if you stand close enough in the right light, you can still see the engraved letters beneath the paint. And when the guide tells the usual story about American ingenuity and industrial strength, the metal seems to whisper a quieter one, about a man who disobeyed orders to make an idea live. The film of time has buried his face, his voice, his records. But somewhere in the mathematics of survival, his work endures. Every tank that deflects a shell, every soldier saved by a few degrees of difference, carries the echo of that rejected blueprint. War forgets its thinkers faster than its heroes, yet their ghosts shape every future battlefield. In the end, the truth of Walter Hensley's life remains half myth, half engineering note. His design was real. His name almost wasn't. But when the light hits the armor just right, 47 degrees to be exact, it tells the story for him. He didn't vanish. History just couldn't explain him.